Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome along to DBA Fundamentals Down Under for the month of June. My name's Warwick Rudd, and once again, I'll be hosting you for this month. This month, we've got Ike Ellis talking to us about the 14 habits of great SQL developers. Now, before I do hand over to Ike, I do have some housekeeping just to run through, and then we'll get started with this month's session. So first off, a big thank you to our sponsors, SentryOne. Without our sponsors, it makes it difficult for us to put on these sessions for you. So if you haven't already gone to the SentryOne website, make sure you do. They have some fantastic articles, videos, downloads, ebooks, etc. to assist you on your data platform learning path. So with that, one of the things on a learning path, PASS has introduced at PASS Summit 2019 a new pathway, which are curated 75-minute general sessions that help you follow along on improving your performance. And so as we can see here, we've got an intro to AI for everyone, which will be delivered by Melody Zacharias. A behind the scenes look at machine learning on AI and DL, and that is by Anna Thomas. And then you can break down into some other AI for developers, AI for the DBA, AI for the professional, and AI for the analyst. So make sure you have a look at the learning pathways to increase your learning on those topics. We are wrapping up the Data Privacy Week, so make sure that you can go to the entry page for Data Privacy Week, watch the recordings, download the white paper so that you can stay up to date with everything around data privacy. You may be aware that SQL Server 2008 is coming close to end of life. To help you if you haven't already migrated, but to learn about all things 2019, make sure you have a look at the Modern Migration Tour in a city near you. To do that, have a look at pass.org, modernization.aspx. We've got upcoming in 2 weeks' time, the next edition of the PASS Live Book, and we've got Melody Zacharias talking to us, and she will be talking on, it hasn't actually got her topic up there. That's a bit silly, but anyway, sign up for that and you'll be able to learn from Melody on June 26th at 1800 UTC. For those of you who are interested in a career with PASS, you can go to pass.org careers and you too can join the fantastic crew who look after a lot of things globally that assist many of you to learn. With that, stay connected with PASS, follow on Twitter with the hashtag SQLPass, on LinkedIn at SQLPass, Facebook at PASS Community. With that, I'll now hand over to Ike to get today's session going.
Hey guys, thanks for joining me this evening. I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to ask Warwick, can you see my screen okay?
We can.
Great, okay. So did you see where this says, Summit 2017? Actually, I believe I delivered this 2018. I did deliver this 2018. So something happened at PASS Summit last year. At the last minute, they had a cancellation. And they asked me, they said, would you want to deliver another session? I was already there for one session and they said, do you want to deliver another session? And I said, yeah, I'd be happy to do that. What do you want me to speak about? And they said, you could speak about anything you want to speak about. That's what they told me. And I don't know if you know much about submitting to these really big conferences, and PASS Summit is a really, really big conference. But they never do that. They have like content directors and they have track leaders and they have a board and they have like all kinds of people that are there to kind of make sure that you speak on what they want you to speak on. But it was kind of a rare thing. I was really flattered that, and I said, all right, let me think about it. So I thought and I thought and I thought. And finally, I landed on this topic. I thought, I've been a consultant for a long time. I've had a rare career in that I've been a consultant for the whole career. And I've never actually worked for an internal like IT department or anything like that. I've always been kind of a hired gun. And as a result, I've had a great opportunity to interact with really good developers, including this week. This week I'm at a business this week with a bunch of architects and a growing company, and I've had a chance to really work and develop with the really great developers. And I've actually had the opposite experience too. I've had the opportunity to talk to and interact with really, really bad developers. And when people bring in consultants, sometimes we have the unfortunate task of like evaluating people, and that might even lead to them losing their job. It's pretty sad, but sometimes that happens. And so what I've noticed is that, just like Tolstoy said, every unhappy family is unhappy in their own way. There are a lot of ways to be bad SQL developers and bad data developers, but I've noticed that the great developers have some commonalities. And I thought that, a lot of us might have elements of great developers, and a lot of us might have elements of being bad developers, and that this session would serve as a reminder to those of us who strive to be good at what we do. We strive to be craftsmen and craftswomen. We strive to just limit our mistakes and always get better and better at our job, that we could use this slide deck as a reminder for doing that and to keep our skills sharp. And again, the title of this session is about habits, not about a bunch of other things that it could be about. For instance, this isn't a SQL internals lesson. This isn't a SQL language best practices lesson. This isn't, you could go to, Brent Ozar or, Adam Mechanic or, Kaylin Delaney. You could go to a wide range of people who will tell you a lot about the internals or about performance tuning, Grant Fritchie, Steve Jones, a lot of people out there that will help you with that. But I wanted to create content that I thought was unique, that wasn't out there already, and that was necessary. And so this deck is probably good for all developers, not just SQL developers, but I felt like SQL developers could use this. And this isn't like a Dave Letterman top 10 list. Like if I were trying to keep you guys to the very end, right? I would do this in reverse order. I'd say number 14, and then we would go and go and go. And then I'd say number 1, right, at the very end. But really, I just want you to know the top 3 right off the bat. And so if you just stick with this for the next, 10, 15 minutes, you're gonna learn 3 habits that I think really distinguish great developers from average developers. And then you can go, enjoy your day. You don't have to stick around. You're not going to hurt my feelings. But if you find value in the first 3 habits, then stick around and take a look at what the next 14 are. By the way, this slide deck is already online. You can go to my blog, blog.ikeellis.com, and you can see you can download the deck. I guess you could just skip the lecture if you just want to, but you're going to miss some good stories, I think. I see that in the chat window, people are chatting. Should I be looking at this? Is this anything? Oh no, it's just Warwick. Okay, great, awesome. Okay, so habit number 1, by far the most important thing you can do to distinguish yourself is to use source control. So one time I was working with a customer, and this was a customer I'd had for a very long time, and he was a leader of software developers, and he said that he was really angry with his team and that he was getting ready to fire everyone. He was going to fire the whole staff. And I was shocked by that. I said, why would you do that? Like, I know your developers, and some of them are really good. Some of people I really like working with. And others of them are like, yeah, they probably deserve to be fired. But he said, you know what, I want to fire these guys because they miss all their deadlines. They don't deliver software. I never know what they're going to deliver and what they're not going to deliver. I never know, what they're doing day to day. And then, they always surprise me. And then when they do deliver something, it's buggy. It has all the same problems over again. So I'm just frustrated by the whole process, right? And so I told him, I said, well, as their leader, maybe you should be fired. And I know that sounds kind of funny, but I did say that to him. I said, this is your team, you're leading them. And he said, you're not helping, Ike. He said, I just really want to start fresh. And I said, look, I know some of your guys, and some of your guys are really, really good, and some of them are not. So why don't you just keep the good ones and get rid of the bad ones? And he said, I'm having trouble distinguishing who those are. He wasn't a developer, right? He was a business person. And he said, I don't understand how to tell a good developer from a bad developer. And so I'll ask you guys that question. You know, how would you decide the difference between a good developer and a bad developer? I can tell you how people have done it in the past that are very poor at doing it. Like IBM, when they wrote OS2, they did it by lines of code written, right? How many lines of code did all these people write, right? They actually incentivized that. They bonused people based on how many lines of code they wrote. And that was awful. OS2 became this big bloated mess that used too much memory and a failure, right? So obviously, you know, great developers don't write more code than bad developers, right? In fact, probably they write a lot less code. You know, somebody who said, how about on bugs registered, right? Like if somebody wrote code and then that code ended up being a bug, like we would dock them for that, and we'd say, hey, you know, you're dinged, you're going to go up on some board because you wrote a bug, right? And actually, what I've noticed is that great developers write more bugs than average developers do, and that's just because they don't believe in like anything being like a sacred cow, right? If they see code and it's offensive to them, even if nobody else wants to edit that code, they will dive right in and they will edit the code, right? So we couldn't use that like bugs, so there are all these metrics people have come up with. It's been a very difficult time figuring out if that metric is a good metric for distinguishing good developers from average developers. But I talked to my good friend, and later he became my business partner, Scott Reed. And I asked Scott, who I considered a great developer. I thought Scott was an amazing guy. And I said, Scott, what would you do if you had to distinguish great developers from average and you weren't very technical? And he said, you know what? I bet I could do it almost solely based on the number of times a day they check in their code to source control. He said, I have noticed that great developers check in every day, every hour, sometimes several times an hour. And I have noticed that bad developers check in every few days, or maybe once a week, or maybe never. And I said, why do you think that's true? And he said, because source control, when you make a change and you check in, right? So let's say you make a change and you verify the change and you say, I like what I did. You check in. And then you make a change and you go down a rabbit hole, you rip out like 1,000-line store procedure, you're ripping the store procedure apart and you don't like what you did, then you roll back. And when you roll back, maybe you lost like an hour of work and that's acceptable, but you didn't lose like 5 days of work, right? Which would not be acceptable. So source control is being used by these developers to do dangerous things so that they have a safety net that will catch them, right? There's a lot of benefits to source control you can read about on this slide, but fundamentally, great developers like to do crazy things that no one is doing, and they like source control to catch them when they fall and they fail, right? So habit 1, use source control. Okay, habit 2. This is a poster that my company, Crafting Bytes, has on the wall. Test twice, then test again. That's Elf. He's testing a Jack-in-the-Box. I don't know if you remember that in Elf. But when we were going to name our company, we thought about naming our company Test Double because we thought that testing really distinguished us from everybody else. But that domain was taken and it was a different testing company, and so we decided not to do that. So we settled on Crafting Bytes. But testing was like a really major part of our culture. And what we've learned about testing is that testing, as a SQL developer, testing is our responsibility. It's nobody else's responsibility, which means we don't rely on a QA department. We don't say, oh, the customer needs to test that. Like I wrote it and somebody else makes sure that it's the right thing, right? No, the developer uses automatic testing to determine if they wrote the right thing or not. And then they check that test into source control, back into habit 1. So why is testing going into source control important? It's because when you write a test, right? Like if we go into SQL Server Management Studio and we look at the t-sql t example, and this is not a t-sql t session, but it's just an example of what a good test looks like. So if we go to programmability, stored procedures, you'll see a test, and these tests have spaces in the stored procedure name. Like if I right click and I modify this, right? You can see that when they made this test, they named it, like I know I've got a lot of windows open, but they named it test email is not sent if we detected something other than Higgs boson, right? So this test has a name, and that name is very descriptive, right? That name could be like test that all of our licensed drivers are at least 16 years old, or test that if somebody is registering for life insurance that they have paid the minimum payment, or test that before somebody changes their password that they are properly logged in, right? Now, a good test has very good language that's very verbose. And so we check that test into source control, and then 6 months from now, when we make a change and this test fails, what we have done is we have preserved developer intent, right? And that's really important in a properly written test, is that the developer intent is easily lost over time. Like, have you guys ever been in a room where you look at each other and you're like, why did we write that? Why, who wrote that? Why did they do that? Why is that code in there, right? Those, if code is tested properly, those conversations happen, less and less. So we want to write good tests because we want developer intent to last over time. And there's a lot of other testing benefits, and you can look in the deck later and discover those, but that's the main one, is the intent preservation. And so take a look at all the testing best practices that are out there. This is not a testing session, but there are a lot of tools that are out there that you can use: SpecFlow and Approval Test and InUnit and LegiTest, which is a product that one of our sponsors for this session, right? Century One, they own that product, they're selling that product. What does LegiTest do? That, Century One selling it. Maybe take a look at it and see what it does. InUnit and Cucumber and Gherkin and all these things, at least test your sprocs, views, and functions that they actually run. Stored procedures are late bound, meaning I can write a stored procedure where the tables don't exist yet. So your stored procedures might be out there in your database and not even running, not even runnable, right? So at minimum, before you deploy, have a little test that calls every stored procedure with the right argument list and verify, do those stored procedures even run? I can't tell you how many times silly mistakes like that hit production for no reason, when a test could have easily caught that before it hit production, right? Now, here's habit 3. This is another poster that Crafting Bytes has on its wall. That's Alec Baldwin from Glengarry Glen Ross, and this lecture is an amazing lecture he gives, and he was on the screen for less than 8 minutes, and he won an Oscar as a Best Supporting Actor for his 8 minutes of screen time. And what he wrote on the chalkboard originally says always be closing, because he's telling this to salespeople, but we used Photoshop and we took some letters off of here and we changed it to always be shipping, to remind ourselves that our job is not to write software. Our job is to ship working software, to ship working product to people. Hey, Warwick, can I swear here? Is it okay if I swear?
I won't hold it against you.
Okay. We used to have a poster here on our wall with the Crafting Bytes logo that had a UPS man, which is a delivery service in the United States. I know it's not worldwide, but he had a brown uniform on, and the poster said, "Ship, motherfucker." And I liked that poster a lot more than this one, but it was in our conference room and a customer complained about it. But anyway, I like the reminder that we are SQL professionals, we're developers, but our title, I wish our title wasn't software developer or database developer. I wish our title was software creator or shipper, because our job is to get working software in the hands of the users as fast as we possibly can, and to do it all the time, like constantly have a culture where we're delivering value to our users and our customers. So in an effort to always be shipping, we should be thinking about how to automate our delivery process, right? Like if my job is to write software and get software out, right? Rather than have a manual process of deployment, we should be scripting it. That's why we have continuous integration. And the database can be in a deployment pipeline. So changes should always go through the deployment pipeline where they can go into source control, be tested, and then be deployed automatically. I was in a session with Grant Fritchie, and he once said, you can either get good at boring, repetitive tasks, or you can get at PowerShell, the Azure CLI, Bash, and scripting languages. And then he said, which one do you think pays more? Like, well, that's obvious, right? The guy that does the scripting pays more, right? So think about that as you're deploying manually, with your schema compare tool you're deploying, but really there's no need to do that, right? You can make that faster and script it out and make it happen at the push of a button. And if you make it easier, you will do it more often. So when Crafting Bytes starts, this isn't a Crafting Bytes sales session, by the way. I'm doing this to explain our culture and how important this culture is to us. So when Crafting Bytes starts with a new customer, one of the very first things we do is we work out their deployment pipeline. Because if we can't ship what we're creating, then we've really increased the chances of failure. Because maybe it will never hit production if we can't get it out there. So I can't tell you how many times we go into a customer and say, your deployment method is a little antiquated. Can we modernize that so that we know our changes for this next project will actually hit production? Oh, the other thing that happens when you don't automate your deployment pipeline and you don't have a culture of shipping is people tend to change things in production. They go to a stored procedure in production, they edit it, and then they done, right? And you ask them, you say, why did you just go into production and change that stored procedure? And they said, oh, because it was fast. Well, that might be true. It might be fast, but you also avoided source control, avoided testing, avoided your deployment procedures, right? That's called database drift when that happens. And it's generally a very bad thing. So you would want to, if you're avoiding how you deploy, that might indicate that there's a problem with your deployment, right? And maybe work out that problem with deployment so that instead of avoiding it, you embrace it. You're like, yay, I get to deploy and I love my deployment process, right? Habit 4 is question, reevaluate, and act. This is Haley Joel Osment from Sixth Sense, and that's Bruce Willis. I don't mean to ruin the movie for you, but Bruce Willis is dead in that movie. And if you watch it through for the first time, it's one kind of movie. And then if you watch it through for the second time, right, you can't see it the same way again because now you have more information, right? And I've noticed, now just for a second, let me pause for a second. The 3 most important habits of great developers we just covered. And if you really do nothing else but you use source control, test, and ship, you will be far better than average. And you will be worth more money and hireable, and every team will be grateful that you're on it. So these next are like diminishing returns. Like, they're important. I've noticed that great developers share these things in common, but they're not as important as those first 3. Those first 3 are very important, okay? Make sense? All right, let's keep going. So let me tell you my story. So when .NET first came out, 15 years ago, it did not allow for nullable types. And so consequently, there was a mismatch. In .NET, you couldn't have nulls in the database, and in SQL Server, you could. And so I just said, no nulls in the database because .NET chokes on it. And then I just said, no nulls, no nulls, no nulls, right? I even wrote a code generator, and the code generator didn't even allow nulls, right? I wrote like an ORM before Entity Framework to like automatically create SQL code because I didn't want to write that stuff anymore. So I was working with a junior developer like 5 years later, and I said, no nulls in the database. And the guy said, how come? And I said, I looked at him like, well, it's because, .NET doesn't, he's like, no. .NET 2.0 introduced nullable types. I'm like, yeah, you're right, it did introduce nullable types. So wouldn't the fact that .NET has nullable types indicate that we could use nulls in the database now? Well, yeah, that's true. We can do that. My point is, like, data's coming at us all the time, and we really have to be very careful that we don't just make a decision and set it in stone and say that that decision is permanent. We have to be careful to always reevaluate as we collect more data, and so that we change our mind and we change our behavior. And so I've noticed that bad developers use phrases like this. Bad developers say, oh, we tried that already and it didn't work anymore. Bad developers say, oh, that'll never work here because our bosses are dumb, right? Bad developers will say, oh, we can't go to the cloud because we tested it in 2012 and the whole initiative failed on us. Bad developers say, like, I don't want to learn that, right? But good developers, great developers, question, reevaluate, act. They say, oh, we dismissed the cloud in 2015, but so much has changed, we need to reevaluate. Or they say, oh, we tried that, but maybe the environment of our business has changed and we need to try it again and see if it works again, right? Habit number 5, always do the simplest thing possible. Do you know what movie this is from? Anybody know? You can't really talk to me, but it's from The Shining. That's the movie poster for The Shining. It's a little maze, and that arrow's cutting through the maze. Always do the simplest thing possible. You know, one time at our company, a company came to us and they wanted to give us $75,000 to write a piece of software, which to us is still a lot of money, you know, US dollars, right? And we were like, yay, a project came that we want to do. And so we had the initial meetings with them, and as they were describing what they wanted, we said, I think you just want us, you know, they went through all this big meeting all day, right? And at the end of the day, we looked at each other and we said, it appears that you want us to write Microsoft Excel. And they said, yes, we want it to be just like Excel. And we said, well, we can just use Excel. And they said, yeah, but Excel does all these things we don't like, right? And we said, that's because you're using Excel as a database, but we could use SQL Server as a database, and we can use Excel as an analytic tool. And they said, well, we don't know how to do that. So we spent 3 days with them, and we changed all their data, and we moved it all into SQL Server, and then we put Excel on the database. We showed them how to load data into the database that we created. We created some ETL tools. 3 days later, it was done, and they were totally happy, right? Again, our job's not to write software. Our job is to create solutions and get it in the hands of customers as quick as possible. So even though that cost us a lot of money, the customer was very grateful because they had something working very quickly that did what they needed it to do. And that goes in code too. Like, yeah, I'm capable of writing a recursive CTE, but that would be difficult to maintain. It would be difficult for me to preserve intent. You know, they say that reading software is more difficult than writing software. And so if you wrote software at your highest capability, you wouldn't be able to read it, right? I mean, that's not literally true, but you get the idea that if reading's more difficult than writing, the more complicated thing you write, the harder it's going to be to maintain and read in the future. So if we always do the simplest thing, even though we're smart, even though we're well trained, even though we have all these years of experience, if we always do the simplest thing possible, we will create maintainable software where we can hire junior developers on our project, and we can share knowledge, and people look at our code and say, I once had somebody compliment me. They said, Ike, I can always read your code. I thought, well, does that mean I'm not very good? Or I don't know. But I think that's a good compliment. You know, strive for simplicity, right? And then it's also more fun to delete code than it is to write it. And I know that's kind of silly, but if you look at a 1,000-line stored procedure and you're able to delete like 250 lines of it, like you're now simplifying the solution later so that you can manage it later, right? Habit number 6, software development at its most fun is a team sport. Like, I get lonely if I'm writing something all by myself, man. Have you guys ever written a book? Or blog post? sometimes I have a hard time motivating myself to write those things because I just get kind of lonely. But one time when I first started my career, um, it was a really fun project. They rented a whole bunch of hotel rooms and they put us in that hotel room for 6 weeks. And we were young, we weren't married. And so it was really easy to do then. I don't think my family would like it if I did that now. But we went for 6 weeks, we stayed in this hotel room. They just brought food in, we just coded. And man, I had so much fun. It was just we watching those guys code and develop this thing. And 6 weeks later, we had a product that people used. They used it for a long time, and I just remember that how great it was. And so we try to make sure that the team is writing software. We don't want like, oh, your job is to write the expense report software, and your job over there is to write inventory management, and then everybody does their own thing, and everybody's lonely. But it's really good if you mob, this is what's called a mob. And mobs are really fun because this is 4 people. That's one computer with great big monitors. That computer has 1 keyboard and 1 mouse and a little bottle of Purell so that we don't give germs back to each other. My company mobs like this. And what is going on is we're writing code together and we're talking about it as we write it. And we might mob for like 2 or 3, 4 hours a day. And what mobbing does is if I know something and you don't know it, it allows us to write software and for me to transfer knowledge from me to you. And that doesn't have to be technical. It could be domain knowledge. Like, let's say Warwick is really, really good at sprinkler systems, and I don't know anything about irrigation. And so Warwick comes to me and says, we're gonna write an app where we can manage sprinkler systems from our phone. I'm like, great. So I start writing code and Warwick is describing sprinkler systems as we're writing code and verifying that. Now, that's a very fast way for me to learn what Warwick knows, right? And maybe I really know JavaScript, and so we're going to write our front end and our phone app in JavaScript. And then Warwick goes on the keyboard, and I'm describing JavaScript to Warwick. Now I'm learning sprinkler systems, Warwick's learning JavaScript, and we're growing. And so it's more than just pair programming when you have like 2 or 3 or 4 people, because now your knowledge is growing and growing and growing as we go. And that's really fun. So it allows us to focus on a single task, complete it, test it, check it in, deploy, and then work on the next item. The other thing that's kind of fun about this is in software development, I've noticed that people they get called in meetings all the time. Like I'm supposed to be shipping software, creating something for somebody to use, and they just want to have a meeting about it all the time. And if you let the meetings get out of hand, you spend more time in meetings and no time actually doing the job you're meant to do. Well, when you have a mob like this, this guy in the glasses can go on a meeting and the other 3 people will keep working. When the guy in the glasses comes back from the meeting, he says, what did I miss? They could just tell him, look, it's moving right along. So people can go to the bathroom, come back, and we just keep progressing and progressing and progressing. It's pretty neat. So mob development, there's all kinds of stuff online to learn about mob development if you want. Okay, habit number 7. This is really important to me. This is Rocky fighting Ivan Drago, right? In Rocky 4, I think. Yeah, Rocky 3 was Mr. T. Yeah, Rocky 4 was Ivan Drago. Fight dependencies. So when you create an application, the more dependencies you have, the higher likelihood you're going to stop shipping to other people. So just like Rocky's beating up Ivan Drago, fight dependencies. Be really angry anytime somebody wants to introduce a dependency. And let me show you the ultimate dependency. Like I'm going to go in here into Paint, right? So if I have a database here, right? So this is my database, right? Okay. And somebody wants to use it, right? So somebody right here, this guy right here, is going to go into Excel, right? And this guy wants to hit the database directly, right? He's going to what's he going to use to hit the database directly? He's going to use t-sql, right? So when they write t-sql in Excel into my database, what they're doing is they're locking my schema. So let's pretend that this Excel file is to close the month, right? That's what they want to do, is close the month, right? And so if I go in my database, and let's say that I've over normalized it and I like want to consolidate some tables for performance, you know, joins are expensive. So I'm trying to get rid of some joins out of my queries. Well, the minute I kind of consolidate those tables, that Excel to close the month that the CFO is using, that breaks. And when that breaks, you know, they can't close the month, they panic and get really angry. And they're likely to say, we don't have time to rewrite Excel, so roll back your changes. Don't change things, right? That is a great example of a dependency. Like now there's something external to me that's stopping me from changing something, right? And anytime you have an architecture that is stopping you from changing something, we should be questioning it, we should be fighting it, we should be removing it. And I know that these databases have dependencies. And the reason why I know is because you might have 300 tables in here, right? But maybe only like 75 have data. Uh-oh, why do I have all these empty tables in here? If I go in there and I say, hey, there's an empty table in your database, I'm going to delete it. No, don't delete it, don't delete it. How come I can't delete it? Oh, because when you delete that table, stuff starts to break, right? That statement tells me that there's some dependencies that need to be decoupled. Or if I go to the server and I say, hey, I want to rename that server, or I want to upgrade it. Or, you know, here's a good example, and I think I've got a slide. So look at all the slides I have on fight dependencies. I don't even see my slide, right? Here, watch this. I'll go back to my database, right? Let's say that I have two databases here. So I have DB1, and down here, I have DB2, right? And down here in a stored procedure, it says db.dbo.customers, right? Or maybe I should not use DBO, it's confusing. Sales.customers, right? So in here in a stored procedure, I might say something like select star from db.sales.customers, right? So in this code over here, that's a three-part database name. What I have done when I have code like this is I've made DB2 dependent on DB1. And what happens if in DB1 I want to like move it? I'm like, wow, DB1 is really busy. So let's move it to its own server. When I move it to its own server, DB2 is going to break, right? Those are now two things that are dependent on each other. So that would tell me that I need to remove that dependency, which means I need to figure out a new way to share data so that I haven't tightly coupled these two databases together. Even worse than that is if I use four-part names, server.database.schema.custom.table name, right? Now I've tightly coupled two servers. And if you've ever gone and said, hey, we want to upgrade that server to SQL Server 2019. Oh, no, don't do that. We have to test everything. Well, what do you mean everything? Every app we have to test. The minute you have a statement where you say, we can't make this change because we might have to test everything, that means that your testing surface area is too large. And the number one things that makes testing surface areas that large is dependencies, too many dependencies. So we fight dependencies, we try to isolate, we try to make things smaller. If we make things smaller, they're changeable and testable and independent of one another. And that's what we're really looking for. You know, this is basically the heart of the microservices architecture movement, right? Microservices says every different little tiny app has its own database, and only that app can touch that database so that we can change them independently of one another. And we don't allow people to do this, right? This whole thing, this is like really, really awful, right? So this whole thing that we do here, womp, you know, little red line, womp, we don't allow that. So how would we decouple Excel from the database? How would we decouple these two databases together? There's all kinds of ways to do that, right? You can use views. You can use DNSC names. You can use stored procedures. You can use ORMs. You can move your data into another database that they can use, but you're moving it so that if you want to make a change, you just change your movement method and then they never notice, right? You can use an API. You can, you know, all kinds of things. But the point is, I'm not trying to solve all the problems all in one presentation, but you know, do your very best to fight dependencies, and you will find that your database stays fresh and easy to change. And you know what happens in business is when business says, "Hey, go make that change for me," and we say, "No, we don't want to do that." Usually we don't want to do that because we don't understand how that change will affect everything else. And typically that happens because we have this spider web of dependencies, like a house of cards, that we just don't understand. But if we fight those dependencies and we get them down to a manageable level, when management comes and says, we want to make a change, we embrace that change. We say, yes, we will make that change. Absolutely, that sounds good, right? All right, embracing change is a good thing. Okay, habit 8, code for resiliency and code for the cloud. You know how much time I've looked at code and I never saw any error handling in it. Like, you know, this is just a reminder to do the things we know we should be doing. Handle our errors, flag, fix, and fail. Do a connection retry. You know, we make assumptions like that database is always going to be online, and so I can just call it whenever I want. But what happens if it isn't? We should log the fact that it didn't go online. We should have retry intervals. We should do things we know we should be doing, like we keep transactions short. We don't allow the system to roll back a transaction unless we deliberately roll back the transaction, right? And then we fight deadlocks by having a table update order document. Habit number 9, love your tools. Like, you know, there's some new tools out there. Have you guys played with Azure Data Studio yet? ADS. It's an amazing tool. You know, one of the cool things about ADS, here, I'll show it to you. I'll bring ADS up. Azure Data Studio. It's one of my favorite things. Have you guys ever seen a Jupyter notebook? Azure Data Studio has notebooks built into it. So this tool, you know, it says Azure in it, but we can use it with an on-premise SQL server. So like here with my local host, I can use it right here, right? I'm going to close all these windows. Close to the right. Don't save. Don't save. Hey. Okay, there we go. All right, so I connect to my little local host here, and then what I can do here later that, they always update it. And then once it connects, come on, connect fast. Everyone's got stuff to do. What I can do is I can create a new notebook. And what this notebook does, what? That's crazy. I was just doing it, it worked fine. Oh, there we go. All right, yay, the notebook's working. Okay, so I'm going to do a new notebook just to see if I can get one up there. Great. Oh, it's the same one. I don't know why it's doing that. That's kind of a weird thing. But so what a notebook does is it allows us to write code and see the results of the code in this little window. So like select count from sales to customers. I have 91 customers, right? Select top 1,000. Now I see all of them. So it's the code, result, right? And look, you can, this is just text, right? If I do text here, I could just type in, I could say, Warwick, aren't notebooks cool, right? Okay, and then if I want more code, I put code in and I say like select quantity from sales dot order details. And then I just run it. And I see all the quantities coming out, right? Okay, why is this neat? It's because it allows us to keep the results by the code. Do you know how many times I see the same query 5 different ways and they're just highlighting it and running them one at a time to compare them? Well, now you don't have to do that. The results are stored point in time to when you ran it. So as you modify things, you get to see the changes as they happen going down, right? This is a free tool. You can download and use this tool right now. My point is like, love these tools. Like new features are coming out in SSMS and Profiler, extended events. Like we should know what those things do. We should see what those features are. We should explore and play and learn. And I've noticed that great developers do that. And average developers are like, I know enough. I was on a project, I don't want to call anybody out, but I was on a project last month where they said, we don't use the SSIS database. We only do XML configuration files. I'm like, why? And they're like, oh, because that's what we know. I'm like, they changed that in 2012. Like, we're going on 6 or 7 years now. Like, we can learn something new. It's way better. Let's learn something new. So anyway, don't be afraid to learn something new. Okay, so by the same token, love your language. There's so many cool things that you can do with SQL now, concat and tricast and windowing functions and column store indexing and in-memory tables and procedures, and you can put R and Python right into stored procedures. Like, there's so many cool things to learn. So just love the languages, love the product. If you love it, you'll want to learn more and more about it, and you'll be a much better developer as a result. Habit number 11, high performance and high security, by the way, are not created by accident. And I've noticed that great developers think about concurrency. They think about when they create a stored procedure, they don't just index to make that stored procedure faster, they index to make the entire system faster. So they try to cover a lot of their queries with indexing. And they don't just think DBAs do that and I just write code. No, they bake in high performance and high security. Security they take as their responsibility. They don't just say, oh, I only encrypt things when they tell me to, right? A great developer thinks about something and says, you know what? That should be encrypted. Like, we need to make sure that we do things the right way. And I don't need to be told to do that. I can do it right now, right? Habit 12, great developers leave it better than you found it. Just like in Back to the Future, this is a real poster that we have on our wall. That's Marty McFly. He left, 1955 better than he found it, right? And we strive to do that, right? If we're in code, I've got a developer that works for me, Jason Rollins, and J-Raw, we call him J-Raw. I always know when he's been in the code because it looks cleaner than the last time I saw it, right? And he just has this thing about him where bad code is offensive to him. And if he sees bad code, he goes in there and cleans it up, right? So we do that. We don't look at a stored procedure that's 5,000 lines and say, oh, I'm just going to leave it that way, right? We go in there, we roll up our sleeves and we dig in and we leave it better than we found it, right? So if we see code that's not testable, hard to change, bad performance, unsecure, we clean that up, right? Okay. Habit number 13, I've noticed that great developers respond with a sense of urgency. So when users call us, they feel that they've got a big problem. And average developers, they don't answer their email, they don't pick up their phone, they're hard to get a hold of. I'm not saying respond immediately. That is not what I'm saying. I'm not saying you have to respond to every email when you get it. I'm not saying that you have to respond to email all day long. You could wait 4 hours to answer email. You can wait 7 hours, right? But when your users are worried about something, you will find that if you respond with the same degree of intensity that they're interacting with you, that they will feel like you are their partner, that you are listening to them, that you care about them, that you are on it, right? When the user calls and they're upset, say, oh, I understand you're upset. I can see that this would be upsetting, but don't worry, I will fix this so you don't have to worry about this any longer. Right now, you've calmed them, right? Your degree of urgency and taking them seriously has now eased the situation and it's built trust with the user, right? Bad developers are like, why are you bothering me? Bad developers are like, oh my God, it's her again. I don't want to call her. Bad developers are like, I can't believe I have to deal with these people. These users are dumb, right? They're not dumb. They're our customer. And, or they might be dumb, but that doesn't mean that they're not valuable. They can be stupidly valuable, right? So just respond with urgency. And then habit 14 is time's your most valuable commodity. So protect it. Great developers stand up when they realize a meeting isn't necessary, right? They're like, you know what? I can tell I'm not needed here. I'm going to leave and I'm going to go about my time and spend my time wisely. And then finally, you should be tracking your time, because if you work for a company and at the end of it, you say, I want a raise. And they say, why? You can go back into your time document and you can say, remember last July when I worked all weekend? Remember when I released that one feature that saved everybody tons of time? Like, I want more money because I'm valuable. My time is valuable and I make the very most of it. And if you do that, what I want is for you to get paid what you deserve. And if you're a great developer and you continue to hone your skills and do great things, you will be worth more than an average developer, and you should be compensated appropriately for that. But that won't happen if you don't record what you've done, so that when you have that conversation, you can be very clear about what you accomplished. That's it, you guys. I realize this is a weird session in that I didn't have a lot of code to show. I was just messing around, but I hope that you got some value out of that. Thanks for coming. If you want to get a hold of me on Twitter, I'm at Ike_Ellis, and I do a lot of things around the community. You can look at my website and blog and all sorts of stuff to find out what I do, but just follow me on Twitter and I'll tell you what I do, make videos and stuff. I'm speaking at Past Summit this year twice, and I'm doing 2 precons. I'm doing a precon on moving transactional databases into the cloud, and I'm doing a precon on DevOps, database DevOps with Redgate. Thanks so much, guys. Let me know if you have any questions.
No problems. Thank you very much, Ike. Everybody, as Ike said, the chat windows are open. So if you do have any questions, we do have a little bit of time now to ask those, and we can get Ike to answer those. So shoot them through. So Ike, while we're giving the attendees a little bit of time, you were mentioning about the feedback that you were asked by clients for the team members and some of the tips that you've given in today's session. How much of that do you see people taking on board?
What do you mean? How much does it actually invoke change?
Yeah.
That's a good question. It depends, right? Like when you try to change culture, culture is very hard to change, right? Like the Romans got mad that the Jewish people kept rebelling, and so the Romans decided to literally destroy all their cities, right? They basically said, this Jewish culture keeps rebelling against Roman rule, and the only way to change it is to just destroy and scatter them all over Europe, right? That was a pretty extreme response to changing culture, but it was effective, right? Except that we're still living with the repercussions of that, 1,500 years later, right? 1,800 years later. So my point is, like, many people have tried to change culture, and you just have to be really patient, right? Like, we don't want to be like the Romans and just be so extreme about it, right? But instead of changing culture, like how many people have started a diet and 3 weeks later you give up, right? It's because change is hard. It's not that you're a bad person if you failed at dieting. It's that change for all of us, it's very difficult to do. And so rather than, I think changing culture begins and ends with forgiveness, right? We have to have the ability to say, it's okay if we make mistakes. We want to use source control more, so we're going to implement source control. Sometimes we're just going to make mistakes, but that doesn't mean we're not going to try hard tomorrow to use it, right? And we're going to remind each other. We're going to support each other and remind each other. That kind of forgiving attitude, I think, works better than threatening. If you don't use source control, you're fired, right? That it's just stressful, and then people feel bad about themselves, right? Why didn't you test? You're an idiot, right? That's not very helpful. But hey, I noticed that code was untested. Let's sit down and write a test for it. What else are we got to do? Let's do it right now, right? That's helpful, right? And you just kind of like are very patient. And what we really want is we want tomorrow to be better than today. And if tomorrow is better than today, we are successful. And if tomorrow is worse than today and morale is low, then we are lacking and we need to do better, right? So it's not so much the destination, it's like the continuous journey to be better than we are today, and that we're all working well together. That's what we're striving for. And if we do that, you know, it's less important that they follow all my guidelines and more important that they're dedicated to making tomorrow better. Everybody will be happy if we do that. You know, I've noticed, I know I'm pontificating now, but I've noticed, like, if everything's perfect, but you go and you say, oh, I'm taking this chair away and using it, here's a metal chair to sit on, like morale goes down the toilet, right? But if they start in a metal chair and you take the metal chair and you give them a new chair, but now they still have like a milk crate for a desk, morale improves and they're happy. It's funny that humans, things could be perfect, but one thing goes south and people get upset. But things could be far less than perfect, but if they see continuous improvement, they want to stick around to see how the story ends, right? So the reason why we striving for improvement, even when things are bad, is way, way better than just letting things get worse.
All right. If nobody has any questions, I'd like to thank you all for attending this month's session for DBA Fundamentals Down Under. I'd like to thank Ike for his time and taking us through the 14 bad habits of, or 14 habits of great SQL developers. And I'd like to see you all again next month, same time, or second Tuesday of the month at 12:30 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. Thank you all.
Thanks, guys. Thanks.